The next two thinkers we'll look at are Michelle Alexander and Marie Gottschalk. Of course, we've read excerpts, and maybe you've read the entire book. Michelle Alexander's famous The New Jim Crow, which is one of the more important books of the last decade, if not only because it really made a lot of people aware of the connections between slavery, Jim Crow, and the incarceration crisis, and made it really accessible for a lot of people. So there is some critiques of the narrative in this, and following Michelle's work over the past, as this book came out, she's herself become more progressive, and even herself has some critiques of this text, but it still is a very important text, a very important research text, because as we see, there's a lot of, because she was a lawyer for the ACLU, there's a lot of very important history of the court cases, the way that court rulings shape the law and shape how we interpret the law. But her main reasons, which we have looked at briefly and we will look at more in depth, have to do with the through line from the abolition of slavery, through the black codes, through New Jim Crow, through redlining, through the incarceration crisis that we are talking about. And basically, she looks at the racial caste system in the history of the United States, and rightly compares it to apartheid, South African apartheid. And this kind of peels back the veneer of equality and liberty and democracy that is part of the identity and narrative of what it is to be an American, to expose, as others have done throughout their career, Wakant and Angela Davis, to name a few, the way that American dream is always built upon a foundation of violence, that is full of exclusion, marginalization, and blood. And it continues to be that way in very sometimes subtle, if you're not really attuned to these things. But once you start to see it, it's not so subtle. And now we are certainly living in a time where our leaders are not even afraid to just be outright racists, and to develop policies that clearly are directed at further excluding and marginalizing these underserved communities and populations. The third thinker that I will mention is Marie Gottschalk in her book Caught, which you have just the first chapter of. And sometimes when people read this small section, not only with this reading, but with other things, they immediately become critical that certain things aren't mentioned, or it doesn't quite fit into the way they see the narrative going. And just a general statement, one specifically about this and others, these are small sections of much larger books, much larger careers. So this is a few pages from a 300-page book. So of course she goes into it more in depth and makes the argument a little more clear. But the other thing is, oftentimes we think that critique, or to be critical, is simply to find out what's wrong with a work. And while that may be part of it, the first step of critique is figuring out what the author is trying to say and what they might get right, kind of give it the best reading possible. And then from there, point to what are things that could be improved. So, one of the ways that we think about critique, whatever type of critique of art, critique of society, is that it's simply a negative action, simply a tearing down, but really the function of critique is a positive action of making the thing better, right? I mean, certainly there are some things that are just wrong, right? But in terms of the critical engagement that I'm asking for in your reading responses and in reading these texts, is something to try to give it the best reading possible, and then what is left out and what can be improved so that we move beyond and build the critique in a more substantial and comprehensive way. So Marie Gottschalk-Scott, what she points to, and this is important, is that if we limit ourselves to one single explanation of the cause, in this case, she is interlocuting Michelle Alexander. She's not saying that Alexander is wrong by any means, but she says that if we just limit it to some through line like race as being the cause or class as being the cause, that we really miss how complicated and how comprehensive the reasons are for this carceral explosion and the reason why the carceral net is widening. So she says, and I'm looking at page 4 of chapter 1, bluntly stated, the United States would still have an incarceration crisis even if African Americans were sent to prison and jail at, quote, only the rate at which whites in the United States are currently locked up. So, of course, we know that the system of policing and law and order and incarceration has been primarily directed at persons of color. But even if we were to somehow make those incarceration rates more contiguous with demographic rates of society, we still would have an incarceration crisis. So in addition to the causal story of race and systemic racism and racial violence, there has to be something else to that contributes to this explosion. And she also writes on page 5, even if we could release all drug offenders today without other major changes in U.S. laws and penal policies and practices, the United States would continue to be the world's warden. So another major component to the carceral explosion was certainly the war on drugs, which intersects with the war on persons of color. But even if we were to eliminate those populations, we still would have a carceral crisis. So she wants to look at the ways in which, and kind of slides into Murakawa's reasoning, but Murakawa is dealing more with liberal and neoliberal policy. This is dealing more with the kind of economic practices. I mean, they're connected, but just in terms of the emphasis. And Gottschalk writes on page 7, key economic factors discussed in this book include deep structural changes in the job market, growing income and other inequalities, the escalating political assault on the public sector and organized labor, and the economic decline of wide swaths of urban and rural America, which she ties to neoliberal policies in general and the way those are overdetermined and infected by the language of the market. So the main point here, she goes, the central theme of her text is how the deep penetration of neoliberalism into nearly all aspects of U.S. public policy and politics is fostering economic and political inequalities and eroding democratic institutions. So she wants to look beyond what she sees as the narrow, and I don't mean that in like wrong or limited ways, that these single explanations for the carceral crisis look at the causes, that it's much more systemic, it's much more has to do with just this, again, to re-invoke Mark Fisher and his notion of capitalist realism, the way in which market language, market ideology, consumer capitalist ideology, neoliberal policies are the real seedbed that then contribute to and exacerbate racism, classism, sexism, and all of the ways that the marginalized communities that are created and excluded by these policies are then dealt with in terms of criminalization and warehousing them in prisons.